I'm selling this house because I'm moving in with my girlfriend. My father, who betrayed my mother, was hurting her even more. The house was in my father's name, but my mother had contributed a significant amount of money to build it, and she loved this house. Yet my father claimed everything as his own without consulting her. 12 years after my parents' divorce, I came to understand what I couldn't back then, and I decided to take revenge on my father. I couldn't forgive him for hurting my mother, who had desperately raised me while he lived carefree. Does your company condone infidelity? That's what I said during the interview at my father's company. My name is Susan Anderson, a 21-year-old college senior currently job hunting. When I was in the 4th grade, my parents got divorced and we moved to my mother's hometown. Changing schools and environments had a huge impact on me, and I became emotionally unstable. At school, everyone knew my last name had changed, and since I wasn't very outgoing, it was hard to make friends. Being the child of a single parent, I was often left out, and I didn't have the courage to start conversations. For the 2 years until I graduated elementary school, I had no close friends and felt out of place, often feeling sad thinking about my old friends. My mother was working all day, so we spent less time together. And I was mostly with my grandparents, although they cared for me a lot. I found it hard to be affectionate with them, having always been with my parents. However, when I entered middle school, I finally settled down. In middle school, many students came from other elementary schools. So I finally met people who didn't look at me through the lens of my parents' divorce. I made friends and gradually became more cheerful, deciding to stop being sad all the time. I also resolved to not burden my mother, so I focused more on my studies. I was able to receive a scholarship that covered my college tuition, and I spent my days studying and working part-time, wanting to make sure my mother could live a peaceful life. I worked hard to be a dutiful daughter, and despite my busy schedule, my heart was filled with satisfaction. I became more outgoing compared to before, but the old traumas were hard to erase. Until the 4th grade, when my parents divorced, I lived an ordinary life with my father and mother. As a child, I was shy, so while I had friends, I often spent weekends with my family. I think I was a child who loved my parents very much. We always had breakfast and dinner together as a family, and after dinner, we enjoyed peaceful family time. However, at some point, my father started coming home late from work, and there were days when he didn't come back until after I had gone to bed. I was told by my mother that my father, who had a managerial position at the time, had a lot of responsibilities and couldn't come home because of overtime. Although I felt lonely, I understood that our current lifestyle was thanks to my father's hard work. So I wished that my father's work would finish early. Those days continued, and I went to bed as usual, but one night I woke up suddenly and heard my parents arguing. They had never raised their voices at each other before, so despite my anxiety, curiosity got the better of me. I quietly approached them to see what was happening. My father, looking angry, came out of the living room with his bags and said, "Shut up. I prefer her over you. I'm getting a divorce." My mother started crying, and my father ignored her and headed toward the front door. Dad already knew what divorce meant and was afraid I would never see him again, so I ran to him instinctively. I clung to him, hoping he would stop, as he had always been kind and played with me. "Get out of my way." But my father, who had never been rough with me before, pushed me aside without hesitation. I was thrown into the hallway, hitting my body hard. Shocked and in pain, I started crying. I didn't want to believe it, but the pain made it all too real, and I felt even more devastated. I couldn't understand why my father was suddenly so cold to me and was overwhelmed with confusion and sadness. I couldn't stop crying. My mother hugged me, but my father ignored my crying and left without looking back. Seeing my father walk away, I cried even harder, feeling abandoned by him. This event made me afraid to trust anyone other than my mother for a while, making me even more shy. After that, my father never returned, and we stayed in the house, but a few days later, he came back. I had a faint hope that we could be a family again, but it was quickly shattered. I'm moving in with her, so I'm selling this house. Get out. He showed my mother some documents as he said this. This house was built when I was in first grade, and I remember how happy my mother was to have a home of her own. She had said that she and my father had worked together to build it. Despite my mother's protests, she had to give up because the house was in my father's name. So my mother and I were forced to move to her parents' home. I never knew what kind of interactions my mother had with my father after that because I was just a child. But I found it strange that my mother worked so much even though she should have been receiving alimony and child support. I believed that my mother worked hard mainly for my sake, but I thought we would have had more financial leeway with child support. When I was in high school, my curiosity got the better of me, so I asked my grandparents about it. My mother wouldn't want to tell me, and I thought it was a traumatic event for her, so I couldn't ask her. According to my grandparents, my father ran away without paying alimony or child support. My mother contacted him many times about the missed payments, but he became unreachable, so she prioritized our living situation and gave up. I had guessed the divorce was due to my father's affair, and I learned he had betrayed our family. Understanding why my mother worked so hard, I felt both clarity and anger toward my father. My mother decided not to pursue my father further and didn't even try to find his address to demand alimony or child support. I was angry at my father for not showing any remorse, but more than that, I wanted to make life easier for my hard-working mother. She was busy from morning till night, always prioritizing me over herself, and I wanted her to be able to relax. I often wished my mother would take better care of herself. Fueled by my anger toward my father, I became even more dedicated to my studies, aiming to get a good job to support my mother. It hurts me to think of my father living comfortably, but my mother and I focused on our lives. As I entered college and began thinking about job hunting, I started organizing the storage room to create a better resume. I wanted to recall past events, to write about my achievements and experiences. While sorting through the storage room, I found letters from my friends before I transferred schools in elementary school, and I got lost in memories. Amidst this, I came across an unfamiliar box, and when I opened it out of curiosity, I found my father's infidelity investigation reports. I was shocked to find it hidden away like this. I had been trying not to think about my father, but I still wanted to know what had happened between my parents. So, I couldn't resist picking up the documents and reading them. They contained more detailed information than what my grandparents had told me. And as I read, my desire for revenge against my father grew stronger. My grandparents probably chose their words carefully to protect me or didn't know all the details. As I read, I realized my father had done far worse things than I had imagined. He had been cheating on my mother for a long time. And during those nights he claimed to be working late. He didn't even bother to hide it from her. His mistress was 6 years younger than him and seemed to have had a very hard life. She lost her mother in an accident and lived with her father, who had lasting injuries, so she had been working since she was a student to support them. Despite her difficult life, she didn't seem to think it was wrong to destroy another family. The evidence included photos of my father walking arm in arm with this woman, who was visibly pregnant. Seeing their peaceful faces in those photos filled me with disgust. To an outsider, they looked like a happy couple. But in reality, they were two people who didn't care about the misery they caused my mother and me. Up until now, I had tried to ignore my anger toward my father, but seeing this made it impossible. I had a strong desire to bring them both to ruin, but I managed to hold back. I thought about how my mother would be saddened if something happened to me. And I also considered the future of the children they likely had by now. 12 years had passed since the divorce, and if the child in her belly was born, they would be around middle school age now. I couldn't forgive my father and his mistress. But if I acted on my desire for revenge, I would cause that child the same pain I experienced. The thought of not wanting to be as low as my father held me back. However, my feelings of anger were strong, and I couldn't just ignore them. A few days later, on my day off, I decided to visit the address mentioned in the investigation report. Though it was an old address and they likely no longer lived there, I couldn't help but check. When I arrived, the house at the address was not there, leaving me with mixed feelings of disappointment and relief. Part of me wanted to ask my father why he cheated and about my mother, but the thought of meeting him made me nervous. Realizing I would probably never see him again, I resolved to forget about him as I walked back. Then, I saw a nameplate with my father's last name, Wilson. I couldn't help but stop, feeling shaken. Wilson isn't an uncommon name, but I couldn't dismiss the possibility it might be him. I looked closely at the house, which was a single-family home with a large yard and a children's play area. It was a weekend, so school was out, and I could faintly hear children talking. If my father remarried his mistress after divorcing my mother, it wouldn't be surprising if he had another family. This thought filled me with a painful tightness in my chest. The front door opened, and children came out, so I moved a bit farther from the house to observe them. Soon, their parents followed, and although they looked older than in the photos, I recognized my father and his mistress. My father hadn't paid alimony or child support, but had built a happy family with his mistress. Knowing that my father lived comfortably while my mother struggled made me clench my fists in anger. Watching them happily leave as a family, I decided to go to a detective agency and request an investigation into my father's new family. I used my savings and part-time job earnings to fund the investigation. When I received the results a few days later, I learned that my father had been living a smooth life after the divorce and had 3 children. While my mother and I struggled, my father lived without facing any consequences for his infidelity, which filled me with bitterness. Realizing that my father and his mistress could abandon my mother and me and live so easily made me feel both anger and resentment. I wanted them to experience the same pain and suffering that my mother and I had endured. But I also understood that their children were innocent, so instead of seeking revenge, I decided to confront them to find closure. I calmed myself to speak rationally and decided to visit them after school. Knowing my father would be at work and the children at school, I expected to find his stay-at-home mistress. I wondered what she felt while having an affair with a married man and now living a happy life. Thinking about what I wanted to say and ask, I went to the house on a day when school ended in the morning and rang the doorbell. As expected, Dorothy, my father's mistress, answered the door. "Yes, who is it?" With a neutral expression, she responded, and I told her my reason for being there. "How can you live normally after taking my father away from my mother and me and destroying our family?" It seemed I wasn't as calm as I thought, and ended up asking in a harsh tone, What are you talking about?" She looked very suspicious, likely because of the sudden question and her defensiveness. To her, the affair was something she could easily forget. The thought made my chest hurt again. I explained everything about her relationship with my father and his affair 12 years ago. As I talked, the pain from those times came flooding back, and I couldn't help but cry. After finishing my explanation, I looked at her again to gauge her reaction. It was then that I learned even more shocking truths and resolved to seek revenge. Sometime later, I went for a job interview as part of my job hunt. I had good grades and was active in other pursuits, so I had many points to highlight. Thanks to this, I usually passed the document screening without any issues. And this time, when I met the interviewers, I already had a good impression. There were 3 interviewers, and they asked questions while looking at my documents. Having practiced beforehand, I answered smoothly, and the interviewers' bright expressions and impressed attitudes gave me a good feeling. At the end, they asked if I had any questions, so I decided to ask something that had been on my mind. Does your company condone infidelity? If there is an affair, how do you handle it? The interviewers looked stunned and froze for a moment, not understanding why I was asking. One of them, looking suspicious, said that while there had never been such an issue, there would likely be some form of punishment. When they asked why I was asking this, I explained everything. My father, who cheated on my mother and abandoned her, works at this company and is currently having an affair here. One of the interviewers slammed the desk and stood up angrily. Are you joking? It's disrespectful to say such nonsense here. I immediately responded. Stop yelling just because I hit a nerve, Dad. I knew my father worked at this company and that he was involved in the hiring process. So I had specifically applied for this interview to expose my father's actions. There were many applicants for the interview, so it wasn't guaranteed that my father would be the interviewer, but I hoped to tarnish his reputation regardless. Since my father confronted me, it added credibility to my story, and I couldn't help but smirk inwardly. At first, my father didn't recognize me, but he looked disturbed after seeing my documents. He probably recognized me from my name and background as the daughter of his ex-wife, even if he didn't remember my face. Seeing that I didn't react to him, he seemed relieved, thinking I didn't recognize him. I calmly responded to my angry father. It's true that you cheated on Mom and are currently having an affair with a young woman in the company, isn't it? I'm just stating the facts. The detective agency I hired had found out about his infidelity, not just his new family after the divorce. My father had a serious problem with cheating. Even with 3 kids, he was still fooling around. He was now having an affair with a young female employee at the same company. And there were photos of them walking together happily, making it undeniable. Are you trying to harass me? Do you think you can get away with this? My father accused me of lying, trying to make me look like the bad guy to avoid punishment. He was desperate to protect himself, having hidden his behavior well until now. I replied with a calm and composed expression, almost mocking him. It's the truth, isn't it? I asked because I wanted to know how the company views having such a person in a position of responsibility. My father wanted to make it seem like I was the problem, but that wasn't going to happen. The other 2 interviewers were already looking displeased after witnessing our exchange. I delivered the final blow by showing them the evidence. By the way, this is the investigation report on my father's affair. Please review it and take appropriate action. While my father frantically tried to cover up my statements, I handed the investigator's report to the other interviewers, requesting they address the infidelity issue. As my father tried to grab me, I stepped back and delivered one final message. Dorothy knows about this too, and she said she'll be coming to the company today. I had informed Dorothy about my father's affair when I met her, and she was furious, planning to confront him publicly. So, before leaving the interview room, I made it clear to my father that he had no escape. You told her. Ignoring my father's shocked expression, as he never expected I knew Dorothy, I walked out of the room. Even after closing the door, I could hear my father's yelling, and I felt the stares from other interviewees. Under normal circumstances, I might have felt uncomfortable. But having exposed my father's misdeeds in the interview, I felt relieved knowing he wouldn't have an easy life anymore. I had come to this company solely for revenge, so I didn't care about failing the interview. As I walked down the hallway, my task complete, I heard footsteps running behind me. When I turned around, my father, with a furious expression, came charging at me, his face red with anger. He swung at me forcefully. Startled, I managed to dodge, avoiding injury, but I stumbled and fell on my backside. Looking down at me with a fierce expression, my father shouted, "What have you done, if it weren't for you?" As he tried to hit me again, I realized I couldn't dodge and braced myself, shielding my head with my arms. But before he could hit me, he froze. "What are you doing to Susan? And you, I didn't know about your affair. You told me you were single. You deceived me." Dorothy had arrived, and my father froze in shock. In the position to strike me, Dorothy swung her bag at him, protecting me. "Dorothy, it's not what it looks like," my father stammered, panicking at Dorothy's sudden appearance, but she was furious and they started to argue. Dorothy, yelling loudly, hit my father with her bag, causing a huge commotion. When I had confronted Dorothy and explained the affair, she had no idea my father was married. "Even though I didn't know, I'm so sorry. It must have been so hard for you. I will make amends. I'm truly sorry." She had apologized to me tearfully. As I listened further, I learned that Dorothy met my father through work, and he had helped her a lot as she was struggling in a single-parent household. My father had hidden the fact that he was married and had started a relationship with her. Dorothy had been working since high school to support her father, who had lingering effects from an accident and naturally developed feelings for my father, who helped her. I had always assumed the mistress was a bad person, but Dorothy turned out to be a victim of my father too. It seems my mother had never contacted Dorothy or demanded alimony from her, so Dorothy had been unaware of my father's actions. I wondered why my mother hadn't demanded alimony from Dorothy, but then I remembered that Dorothy was pregnant at the time. My mother probably didn't want to burden a pregnant woman, even if she was the mistress. Thinking about this, I watched Dorothy cry and apologize. I had thought the mistress was also a bad person, but Dorothy's reaction showed she wasn't trying to deceive me. So I also told her that my father was currently having an affair with another employee at the same company. The investigation report I had included details of my father's ongoing infidelity. Since Dorothy was also a victim of my father, she had a right to know about his current affair. When I showed her the documents, Dorothy became furious with my father. He lied about being single, married me, and now this. What kind of person is he? I will never forgive him. Her anger at my father's betrayal was deep, and we decided to seek revenge on him together. Originally, I had applied to my father's company and was scheduled for a second-round interview. So, Dorothy and I decided to confront my father at the company on the day of the interview, exposing him in front of everyone. In the company hallway, they had a huge argument, and other male employees had to restrain my father while security arrived. I then pulled Dorothy away, and we left the company. The commotion drew a large crowd, including the woman I had seen in the investigation photos, who was hiding and watching with a tense expression. My revenge was to expose my father's wrongdoing to everyone, and I successfully did so that day. Afterwards, my father, who was on the verge of becoming a department manager, was demoted to a regular employee due to the affair. The hallway showdown made the situation well known, and he now works under a cloud of disgrace. Once known as a family-oriented and good boss, he is now labeled a terrible person and treated coldly by his colleagues. The woman involved in the affair quietly resigned from the company. Additionally, Dorothy demanded alimony and child support from my father and filed for divorce. With the company's help, my father couldn't escape and had to pay. During the divorce mediation, Dorothy learned that my mother hadn't received any alimony or child support. And it was also revealed that my father spent money on gambling in addition to supporting his mistress. Although he claimed to gamble occasionally, he had been hiding the actual amount of savings from his family. This additional deceit angered Dorothy even more. Dorothy managed to get my father to pay alimony and child support above the market rate. My father tried to evade responsibility until the end, and the divorce and alimony negotiations took a long time to conclude. However, Dorothy persistently confronted him, and the scandal became known to people outside the company as well. As a result, even those unaware of the company's drama gradually distanced themselves from my father. In the end, my father became completely isolated. After the divorce was finalized, Dorothy tried to give me part of the alimony as an apology. This may not be enough to make amends, but please accept it as an apology for the trouble caused. However, I had kept my revenge against my father a secret from my mother, so I declined the money. Dorothy, you're also a victim of my father. Keep the money for your children. My mother seemed to have put the past behind her, and I didn't want to reopen old wounds. I believed that even though my father had been punished, my mother didn't want to revisit those painful memories. Besides, I didn't hold any grudge against Dorothy or her children, who were also victims of my father. I felt concerned for Dorothy and her children, now a single-parent family, and started visiting them often to check on them. Sometimes I played with the children, and we became close. I only hoped these children would grow up to be upright people, unlike my father. As I started seeing Dorothy more often, I realized she was usually calm and not the type to raise her voice. It was hard to believe she was the same person who had that intense argument with my father at the company. Getting to know her, I understood that this was the strength of a mother, and I thought my own mother might have felt the same way during the divorce. Later, I successfully got accepted by my top choice company and shared the news with my mother, who was overjoyed. Seeing my mother happy and proud of my growth made me happy too. With my father's shadow no longer looming over us, I could purely feel the joy. I decided to work even harder to reduce my mother's burden after I started my job, although I couldn't forgive my father for what he had done. Knowing he had received his comeuppance allowed me to finally put it behind me and focus on living a happy life.